Hi everyone! As you may know, I had an album come out last month at the beginning of February, and I have been absolutely overwhelmed by the response so far. The last time I checked, it had already gotten over 12,000 streams on Spotify, which is just mind-blowing to me for a classical music album of music nobody's heard before. This album features 3 cello sonatas by women composers, which I have transcribed for the viola. It's Women's History Month, and so I wanted to take this opportunity to talk about these 3 women. All of them were fascinating individuals who led really interesting, remarkable lives. The first composer on the CD, Henriëtte Bosmans, was a Dutch composer who lived her life in Amsterdam. She was really well respected as a pianist during her lifetime and got a lot of opportunities to perform as a soloist with orchestra, particularly in the 1930s and the 1940s. However, she was half Jewish, which meant her career was derailed by the Nazi occupation of Holland. After 1942, she was not allowed to perform publicly anymore, and so performed in black evenings, underground house concerts to help support herself and her elderly mother. These were quite dangerous. She reportedly had to flee during one concert when it was raided. She was also openly bisexual in a time when that was rare, and it was especially dangerous under the Nazi regime. She had open relationships with both men and women during her lifetime, including the cellist and resistance fighter Frida Belinfante. Frida, pictured here with Bosmans, was a very well-known cellist in Amsterdam and was the inspiration for many of the works for cello that Bosmans wrote in the 1920s. The second composer on the album, Ethel Smyth, is probably the most well-known of the 3. She was English, and there's been an increased recognition of her work in recent years, which is wonderful to see. I came across lots of wonderful stories about her in my research. My favorite is when she was 17, she told her parents that she wanted to study composition, but her father, who was in the military, refused to let her do that. So she locked herself in her room and refused to come out or eat until her father acquiesced. She won the Battle of Wills and so went to Leipzig to study composition. She was apparently unhappy with the level of instruction there, so she didn't stay for very long, but during that time she met Clara Schumann and Brahms, Dvorak and Tchaikovsky. When she came back to England, she wrote a number of operas, 6 of them in fact, that were very well received both in England and abroad. Between 1911 and 1913, she became very involved in the women's suffrage movement in England, and she actually wrote the piece of music that was adopted as their anthem. She even went to jail at one point for participating in a protest to fight for women's rights. Like Bosmans, she was also openly bisexual. She had relationships with both men and women throughout her life, but she never married. She felt that she was too independent and it would have a negative impact on her career if she were to marry. There's a wonderful letter she wrote to her mother where she said something along the lines of, "If I were to fall in love with Brahms, even Brahms, and he were to propose to me, I wouldn't marry him." So she was very adamantly against getting married. There are lots of wonderful pictures of her, many of which I'm showing on the screen right now. In almost all of them, she's wearing a tweed suit. In many of them, she is with her very large dog. She had a really interesting life. She volunteered as an assistant radiologist during World War I. She was a mountaineer, she was a golfer, she wrote tons of prose volumes. So I hope you'll check her and her music out because she's a really interesting character. The final composer on the album is Dora Pejačević, who was Croatian. She was born to the aristocracy, so she was a member of the upper class, but she absolutely rejected her aristocratic roots. She had nothing but disdain for her social class. She was highly educated in many subjects, including music, although she was largely self-taught as a composer. Despite that, she wrote the first modern symphony by a Croatian composer, man or woman, as well as the first piano concerto by a Croatian composer. She was really interested in politics in particular and read widely on many subjects in a variety of languages, including English. Like I said, she completely rejected her aristocratic roots. She wrote many letters saying how much she disdained them and the fact that the upper class didn't work. She didn't understand how people could live without meaningful work. She herself, like Ethel Smyth, volunteered as a nurse during World War I. When she died, she refused to be buried in the family crypt. She wanted to be buried instead in a simple grave with a simple headstone that just said Dora, her first name, and rest now. And she requested that donations be made to the families of impoverished musicians. So she also was a really interesting individual whose music deserves much wider recognition. I hope you'll take some time to listen to the album and get to know the music of these amazing composers. During the month of March, our record label, Aces Productions, is donating 25% of the sales of the physical CD to the Boulanger Initiative, which is an amazing organization that supports the work of women composers. We want to encourage people to buy the physical CD because one, it sounds way better on CD than it does on the streaming services, but also when you purchase the CD, you get a copy of the booklet that includes the liner notes I wrote that goes into much more detail about the lives of these women. So I hope you'll consider listening, I hope you'll consider purchasing the physical album. Thank you so much for watching, thank you for listening, and thank you for supporting this music.